you, Seth.
Good morning. Thank you. Well, the morning gig, the breakfast gig, you're all sort of sitting far away. So first of all, let me just say greetings from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. We are sister think tanks with the Columbia Institute. We collaborate in many areas. We've been very involved in these conferences and speaking at these conferences with municipal leaders here and in British Columbia. We co-host and co-sponsor Next Up, the youth leadership program that Chris was mentioning last night. We are collaborators in a major project in British Columbia called the Climate Justice Project. And we are just beginning a new collaboration on a project that we call the Trust in Government Project. And actually Joel is a collaborator in that as well, and it's a new project that's going to be tackling some of those paradoxes that we confront as progressives around trust in government that Joel was talking about last night. And then as Stephanie mentioned, we have collaborated on the issue of living wage, which is what I'm going to talk to you about this morning. And I'm happy to be here in Toronto. I've been 20 years in British Columbia and was hired 16 years ago to open up the CCPA's first provincial office. But I used to live here in Toronto. In fact, does this count as Toronto? Richmond Hill, it was sort of Greater Toronto. You're the authority. But yeah, I actually started out as a high school teacher here teaching economics at Northern Secondary School, the year of the social contract in the early 1990s. So I'm gathering that all that is old is new again. But it's been a while and I'm glad to be here, and I'm happy to be talking about the living wage. It's so gratifying to see this movement spreading across the country. And I'm happy to have this chance to share with you a little bit about how we've been going about that work in British Columbia. I love this topic of the living wage. You know, I give a lot of talks, mostly in British Columbia, primarily about welfare and poverty reduction and taxes and different BC public policies and various wonkish topics. But this is my favorite, and in particular, one of the pieces of my job that I most love is when I get a chance, usually privately, to walk employers or CEOs and municipal councillors through the living wage calculation. Because when you do that, there's always this eureka moment. Because as employers, and you're all employers, as municipal leaders, and I'm one too, of a small nonprofit. And as employers, we're used to looking at the question of compensation through the lens of the market, which is to say, what's everyone else paying? And if we fancy ourselves progressive employers, we say, what's everyone else paying? And I'll pay 20% more. And instead, when you go through the exercise of inviting someone to instead look at the question of compensation through the lens of what it actually costs to live and raise children here in our communities, it's this revelatory moment. We've never done that before. And I love being in the room for those moments. I also like it because there's nothing esoteric about this topic. I'm in the policy business, and often it does feel esoteric, and often it feels like wins are just out of reach. But this campaign is real. It's very concrete. It matters, and when it's successful, it can have make an immediate material difference to households and families with children. And in particular, for an audience like you, I would say this. I mostly give talks about poverty reduction around BC, and often I'll have somebody from a municipal government or an employer come up to me after the talk, and they'll say, this is all good, And I'm happy to advocate for a provincial poverty reduction plan and a federal poverty reduction plan, but what can we do? What can we actually do ourselves? What's our piece of the puzzle here? And my answer is this. It's the living wage. This is your piece. I would never say, you know, living wage is the end-all and be-all. It's not going to get us off the hook from all kinds of other organizing we need to do. It's not a substitute for the minimum wage campaign. It's not a substitute for making employment standards respected. It's not a substitute for getting deplorably low welfare rates increased, or the work on social housing, or what have you. It's one tool in the toolbox of poverty reduction, but it is a tool that holds great promise. For us, the work around living wage started back in about 2006. Now, let me take a step back, too, and this is, somebody last night was mentioning the question of various BC labor laws that got thrown out by the BC Supreme Court. You may remember when Gordon Campbell was first elected Premier of British Columbia, one of the very first things that he did was he tore up the collective agreement with the Hospital Employees Union. And about 8,000 or 9,000 of those members, mostly women, largely immigrant women, many heads of households with kids, saw their jobs contracted out to Sodexo and Aramark and Compass and all those multinationals we all know and love so well. And they used to make the living wage. And then they had to regain their own jobs at about a 40% pay cut, well below the living wage. Now, the woman who was then their research director and was one of my board members, a woman named Marcy Cohen, and had been working through this issue with them. And she started to become familiar with this living wage issue that some of you, I don't know if Ken Livingston talked about it at all when he was with you, but how it had emerged in London, England, where there was a really vibrant grassroots movement called London Citizens, which had locked on to this issue and really campaigned for it and made the City of London a living wage employer. And the London Olympics were actually the first living wage Olympics. And they had scored many successes. Hospitals had become living wage employers, schools had become living wage employers, universities, and a whole bunch of private sector institutions. Many of the financial institutions in Canary Wharf are now living wage employers. And so we had been following that as an organizing tool, and Marcy said we should do this here. I want to come back to our story in a minute, but just to tell you that this timing being here now is very serendipitous. And as Stephanie just mentioned, I've just come from speaking along with Jamie McAvoy, who's still in bed, but will be at the Living Wage panel. He's heard my spiel many times as we do our Dog and Pony show. So we've just come from this conference in Toronto on the living wage in Ontario. And it was terrific. And it was hosted by, what I'm happy to tell you is, there were many co-sponsors, including Columbia Institute, but the primary host was the new Ontario office of the CCPA. So you're familiar, I'm sure, with the work of the CCPA, and we have various provincial offices, and our head office is in Ottawa, which I guess technically is part of Ontario, but we've never had an Ontario office until now. This event marked the formal launching of an Ontario office that's going to be much more focused on Ontario provincial issues, and hopefully with Columbia, I hope dabbling in municipal issues as well. So I want you to know that that's coming into existence and something that you should be tapping into. At the conference just over the last 2 days, there were about 150 people from many Ontario communities: Toronto, Kingston, Hamilton, Milton, Sudbury, others. Those were the ones I heard in the room. And what you could sense was really a strong appetite and excitement for moving forward with this issue. The campaign is definitely emerging. The CCPA Ontario office will help to lead it and will resource it in much the same way that our British Columbia office has resourced and provided the research backup for the British Columbia campaign that I'm going to tell you about. And I think that living wage campaign will really complement a re-emerging minimum wage campaign now that we've seen that frozen again for a few years in Ontario. The discussion was rich. A number of us were there sharing our experience from British Columbia. There were Acorn people there and people from vibrant communities, and there was an employer panel including Kristen Sutton, who's the managing director of SAP, the big software firm, the Vancouver office, which has become an official living wage employer, and talking about how they did that. So it was a rich discussion. Some of the discussion was sort of technical and about the methodology and the need to standardize the methodology and the approach across the country, because one of the interesting things happening, as many of us are organizing in different communities, is you get some large employers like SAP, which actually has major offices across the country, who are prepared to become official living wage employers across the country and need a standardized methodology for that, but also a standardized national methodology and framework. But one of the other key things, and this came up a lot in discussion and was shared with the Hamilton folks and so on, that's a framework. What's neat about the living wage is that ultimately the calculation is very localized, where you've got a local group of folks figuring out what does this look like in our community, what are those actual costs in our community, what makes sense. So, how many of you actually attended the Living Wage Forum that Columbia hosted earlier this year? For how many of you is this a relatively new concept? Ready to explain a bit more about the living wage and what it is? All right. So, first of all, the living wage is not the same as the minimum wage. Right? The minimum wage is this statutory legal requirement set at a provincial level that all employers, large and small, are obliged to pay. The living wage isn't legislated that way. Traditionally as well, the minimum wage campaigns that we've seen have been based on a different methodology, focused on really a question, which is, when the whole $10 minimum wage campaign was on, it was based on this. What would a single individual working full-time, full year need to make in order to be at the poverty line? And when that campaign started, it was $10. Of course, now that would need to be about $11.50 in today's dollars to achieve that principle. With the living wage, we're doing a calculation, this is the key difference, based on a family with young children. It's a family calculation, and it sets a higher standard. It's not based on just a poverty line. But the other key difference is that it's a fine local calculation. The living wage in Kingston will not be the same as the living wage in Toronto or in Hamilton. It's going to reflect the local cost of housing, the local cost of food. It's fine that way. And then we're looking at the actual, the family's actual expenses in a very modest budget. We're also looking at what they get in government benefits, like the child tax benefit and things like that, and what they pay in taxes. And then we're, from that, calculating an hourly wage. But the living wage call isn't really directed primarily to the provincial government. The living wage call is to employers themselves, primarily large employers in both the public and private sector, to become living wage employers, by which they commit to pay the living wage, not just to their direct employees, but really where the rubber hits the road, to their major service contractors. It's janitorial services, it's food services, it's those private security services, where so many low-wage and immigrant parents are. The context for this, the imperative of why this matters, is around the context of child poverty. this is actually where I have some regret. You know, we partnered with Acorn in different places, but when Acorn launched their campaign in Ottawa, which ultimately wasn't successful, or at least not for now, they went with the same as many American cities, where they went with the definition based on a single individual rather than a family with children. And I think that's a strategic mistake, because you lose that chance to make common cause and form alliances with all of those organizations that are dealing with child poverty and healthy childhood development. Because that's the context for us in which this was launched. For 8 years, British Columbia had the highest child poverty rate in the country, rich as we are. And you know, when people think about child poverty, they tend in their heads to go right to welfare. Right? Now, welfare is the principal explanation for deep poverty in our societies, for families that are not just below the poverty line, but way below the poverty line. That's a story about the inadequacy and inaccessibility of social assistance in our provinces. But when we talk about the breadth of poverty in our society and child poverty, guess what? It's not a welfare story. It's a low-wage story. Right? The vast majority of poor children in my province and in yours live in families with paid income. 35% of poor children in Ontario live in a home with an adult working the equivalent of full-time, full-year in the paid labor force. Their poverty is a low-wage story, which is where minimum wage campaigns come into this and where the living wage comes into this. When you survey, you know, I mentioned for us this also started with the Hospital Employees Union, and years ago they did this exercise asking their contracted out members, what does the living wage mean to you? And, you know, they put all these stickies up on a board. What does it mean to you? And a lot of the items, you know, people listed the items that so many of us take for granted, you know, money for a birthday present and things like that. Money to go to the local pool. But equally evident in what gets put up there were things that relate to time poverty. You know, when the Hospital Employees Union surveyed their contracted out workers, a staggering number of them, not surprisingly, mostly the single mothers, reported that they now had a second job, often in the same health authority. You know, a shift that began, because when you go through the exercise of calculating this family budget, you realize that it is what it is. There's no getting around it. And if you don't make it at an hourly wage, you make up for it in time. And you have the shift that starts at 7 in the morning, and the shift that starts at 3 in the afternoon, and you never see your children. And we all pay for it. Intuitively in these campaigns, people get that we all pay for it. In fact, who primarily picks up the tab? You do. Municipal governments and school boards. So for us with this process, we pulled together, you know, what I jokingly call the egghead table of all these policy analysts and number crunchers and that kind of stuff. And then we did this outreach to other stakeholders. We had the United Way involved, the social planning councils, the dietitians, vibrant communities, faith groups, many unions, immigrant serving organizations. And we developed this methodology for calculating the living family wage. We went out and focus grouped it with both employers and with parent groups. We refined it. But before we did any number crunching at all, we began with principles. What would the principles be that would guide the calculation? What is it we were trying to achieve? And so we wanted an adequate income. We wanted a wage at which a family would be able to participate. And this is an important one for you guys as municipal leaders. We wanted a wage at which a family would be able to participate in the social, civic, and cultural lives of their communities. That was one of the guiding principles. We wanted a wage at which we could ensure healthy childhood development. We wanted a wage that would promote gender equality. We wanted a wage that was something more than a poverty line. The way we defined it was a wage that would allow the family to escape severe financial stress. But at the same time, we were conservative. We wanted to land somewhere that would be seen to be conservative and reasonable, and it has. I told you at the outset, I like walking employers and CEOs through the calculation. Now, when I tell them what the living wage is, there's this big bulk, right? It's a lot higher than the minimum wage. But then you walk them through the calculation, and I have never once had an employer come to the end of that and say that it strikes them as unreasonable. Instead, they're going, okay, I can see this is hard. This is in fact a bare bones budget. Budget assuming a two-parent family, because most poor children, the poverty rate is much higher among single-parent households. But most poor children live in households with two parents. And so we model it on a two-parent household where both parents are working full-time. They have two young kids, age 4 and age 7, so in full-time child care and after-school care. And then we calculate this family budget. And we're looking at their expenses in 10 areas. So food, clothing, shelter. Second most expensive item in the family budget after shelter. Want to guess?
Childcare.
Childcare. Transportation. Another category that's from the market basket measure, which is basically household goods, a very modest recreation budget, non-covered medical expenses. When we focus group this with parents, with low-income parents, they said, if this is going to be a path out of poverty, let us take a couple college courses a year so we can upgrade our education. So we included that. And then there's this one contingency amount, which is basically equivalent to 2 weeks' pay for life, for all of those things that happen in our real lives, between jobs or a death in a family where you can't work. And so that's how you tally the whole family budget. We then run the numbers to make sure that they also work for a single parent with one child. And in the case of Metro Vancouver, when we then distill that down to an hourly wage, both parents working full-time, it now comes to $19.14 an hour. Now, our methodology has now been, so the CCPA, our role in this is that each year, we started in 2008, each year, this was sort of a departure for us at CCPA, right? Usually we publish a report, hand it off on to the next thing. That's what we do. We produce reports. That's what we do. But this time the report launched a campaign that we stay with. And each year we update the calculation in Metro Vancouver, and we produce a guide and a spreadsheet for other communities to replicate the calculation. That's been done in about 10 communities in British Columbia now, where the living wage ranges between 14-something and the high of 19 in Vancouver. And that methodology has been adopted by people like Jim Stanford and Hugh McKenzie, working with some of you in your communities with the living wages here. And I want to emphasize, it's a conservative calculation. So this family that we're modeling, they don't own their home, they rent. They're not saving for their retirement. They're not saving when their kids are ESPs. And we've even kind of put them in this parallel universe where they have no debt or credit card interest payments. All their cash flow is nice and even. So it is a bare bones budget. The neat thing about this for us, in terms of the campaign as it's now advanced in British Columbia, because we have a full-time organizer based with our provincial chapter of Campaign 2000. We're involved, the United Way is involved, the CLC is involved, the Hospital Employees Union, the Provincial Government Workers, the United Food and Commercial Workers, QB, the teachers, ACORN, the District Parent Advisory Committee, various faith groups, various immigrant service organizations, Van City Credit Union, the Medical Health Officers Council, the dietitians. You see how it allows for making common cause across this interesting assortment of organizations. And the campaign's unfolding in 2 tracks. One track is trying to win over large public sector employers, particularly municipal governments, and the other is trying to win over private sector employers. For municipalities, a couple of years ago, we scored the first big victory. which was that the City of New Westminster became the first city in Canada to become an official living wage employer. And Jamie McAvoy, who's here, was the city councillor who championed that and is one of the speakers. An amazing champion of this, and has continued to be a champion of this in forums like this in British Columbia and here. And then earlier this year, the school board in Parksville, Qualicum became the first school board in Canada to become an official living wage employer. And we have our eyes set on a number, we think a number of other municipalities in British Columbia are very close to becoming official living wage employers. Why should you as city councillors help to move this forward? At the conference I was just at, Hugh McKenzie, who many of you will know and has helped with some of this, on one of the panels, he had, you know, I was telling you all the technicalities of the living wage and how we do the calculation and what, you know, the definitions. But Hugh had this one-line definition which I really liked, which was that the living wage is the difference between subsistence and participation. Which the lack thereof is what you as municipal leaders spend so much time lamenting and trying to figure out how to change. You also said, he had this funny line where he said, you know, why do we want governments who say it's bad to pay people well? Which is what we have right now, right? And the truth is, though, I don't think that is what the public wants. So, you know, when we've been engaging, trying to push municipal governments in British Columbia to become living wage employers, you know, one of the ways I like to put it is this. We are the employer when it comes to municipal governments. This is partly why I like having municipal governments as a target for this campaign. We are all the employer, and you are our representatives in doing that. But we are all the employer. Are we okay paying wages on our dime at which you can't ensure healthy childhood development? I don't think so. So let's do it. In Victoria, which also developed the methodology along with us, they no longer call it the living wage. They still do the calculation the same way we do, but they've chosen to rebrand it. Now, I prefer the living wage, but I kind of see where they're coming from. They've renamed it the Affordability Index, which is kind of neat for a lot of the issues that you work on. Right? The basic notion is, it's this line at which a family needs to be. Ultimately, there's many ways of getting there. You can either get there through increasing wages, or you can get there by making things more affordable, by dealing with housing and transit and childcare and all of those things. Who cares ultimately? In fact, for me as a policy person, let me tell you one of the things I most like about the living wage calculation, which is, I told you I've presented this to many employers, and they all get that it's reasonable. That said, I have had employers say, I get this, it's reasonable, I understand the connection to child poverty, I wish I could do this, but I can't do it. I just face these competitive pressures, I couldn't do it. To which we say, okay, but if you get it, then become an advocate. Become an advocate for lower public transit. Become an advocate for more affordable housing. Become an advocate for raising the child tax benefit like Campaign 2000 has called for. First and foremost, become an advocate for universal public child care. If any and all of those things happened, the cash amount of the living wage would come down. It's all hardwired into the calculation. And it invites employers to realize, hey, maybe we should advocate for those things. What I love about the calculation is that embedded in it is this balance between the role of the labor market and wages and the role of good public policy and who does what heavy lifting to get the job done of eliminating child poverty. I don't really care in the end what the balance is, let's just do it. And it allows us to make some common cause there in doing it. It's also just a great tool for building support for a broader progressive agenda and mobilization. I mean, that was, I think, the experience in New Westminster, where you had Acorn creating political space for Jamie, knocking on half the doors in the city, right? And creating something where, and Jamie, I'm not stealing this. So Jamie, who became the champion of this, who took a risk, he was elected 2 cycles ago and eked out the 7th and final spot on council. But he was the one who took a risk, for which he was rewarded and got the number 3 time spot the next time. And then the other part of the campaign is focused on private sector employers, of which there are now 28 in Metro Vancouver who are officially certified living wage employers, representing over 5,000 direct employees, but many more private contract employees. But I won't go into detail there. I'll wrap with this. So it's also taken off in many U.S. cities, and then the next panel, I'm sure Sam will speak to that. And it's interesting. So here, let me read you a quote. Paying the London living wage is not only morally right, but makes good business sense too. What may appear to a company to be an unaffordable cost in a highly competitive market should more often be viewed as a sound investment decision. I believe that paying decent wages reduces staff turnover and produces a more motivated and productive workforce. Who do you think said that?
That was a bad Ken Livingstone impersonation.
It wasn't Ken Livingstone. No, it was Boris Johnson.
No way!
So Ken Livingstone brought in the living wage. But here's my point. So there was this vibrant grassroots group, London Citizens, and it became so popular and strong that none of the political candidates could do anything but promise to protect and enhance it. And you know, I doubt Boris Johnson would have brought it in, but he has become one of its strongest supporters. There's lots of resources out there on our website. Go to livingwageforfamilies.ca to see a whole bunch of other stuff. There's videos. The CCPA Ontario office has just published this terrific paper by a young academic named Jordan Brennan with a whole history of the impacts. We at CCPA are happy to guide other municipalities through the calculation and assist you in figuring it out as we try to standardize that methodology. I encourage you to check out the next panel and hear Jamie, and then the Buffalo experience and the Kingston experience. This movement has legs and it's spreading. And it's had early successes for us. It's had the first city, the first school board, the largest credit union, 28 employers. But really, it's only just scratching the surface of its potential. For me, when this is ultimately really successful, you have enough large employers like municipalities and school boards that have done it. Now they create a market for those private service contractors who in turn pay the living wage. Then they have a recruitment and retention advantage with their competitors. And you would hopefully see this positive ripple impact through the low-wage workforce. It's a great organizing tool. It's connected to other campaigns that we care about. So the minimum wage campaign, the child care campaign, housing stuff, training stuff, transit stuff, taxes. It's all hardwired into the calculation. And so I invite and encourage you as municipal leaders to join us in taking this to the next level and to see it flourish in Ontario. It can make a real difference to well-being and quality of life. As Jamie's experience shows, it's a worthwhile political risk and a great leadership opportunity for you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Seth. I appreciate that.